Well, thanks so much, Chris, and thank you for that warm introduction. Chris said when I was sitting down there, did I want the brief introduction or the long one? And I said, I'll take the brief one, and he said, deal. So that's the brief introduction from Chris, but we appreciate it, mate. Look, I'd like to acknowledge the Darug people as the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Of course, Chris Brown, the chairman of the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue, my friend Cameron Klein, who's the patron of the same dialogue, Cameron. And I'd also like to acknowledge Greg, who's retiring as the head of Catholic schools in Western Sydney, a passionate advocate. Teaching is a vocation, and teaching so many children in the growing part of Western Sydney has been obviously the vocation of his life. We really thank you for your service, Greg. Thanks so much. 3 weeks after I became Labor leader in New South Wales, Sydney went into its second COVID lockdown. And the conventional wisdom for leaders of the opposition is that you must be on TV as many times as possible, and more often than not, hopefully, ripping shreds out of the government of the day. But in the middle of the health crisis, a 1 in 100-year pandemic, my colleagues and I decided that we were not going to do this. And we asked ourselves this question: if we were getting the same advice from the epidemiologists in New South Wales Health and from the Chief Health Officer, Kerry Chan, would we genuinely make different decisions from the New South Wales government? And the answer genuinely was no. So we tried a different approach. Rather than criticising every mistake, echoing every bit of outrage, we offered bipartisan support to Premier Berejiklian to help us get through the crisis. Now, not everyone in my party thought it was a good idea, but the decision not to play politics during the pandemic and undermine public health was the right decision. And as you know, in politics in New South Wales, the media love conflict. And more often than not, myself or Joe Halen or Paul Scully would hold a press conference in or underneath the Tree of Truth, which is where they hold press conferences out the back of Parliament House. I think it's ironically named. But in any event, we would stare down the barrel of the camera, having been asked a question about the latest decision from the New South Wales Premier, and we'd say, we support the government's decision, and we back Premier Berejiklian. And it would never, ever make it on television. But again, it was the right decision to take. And since then, we've tried to be bipartisan and constructive whenever dealing with the policy challenges facing New South Wales. If the government does something good, we will acknowledge it. Where I point to a failure, I do so offering an alternative to the people of New South Wales. And that's particularly important as people in this state offer a judgment about who should run New South Wales from March 2023 onward. But one area that I do believe needs urgent change in New South Wales is planning. We don't believe the planning system is working for delivering the outcomes for the people of Western Sydney or indeed the greater New South Wales. It isn't working for renters, it isn't working for first home buyers, it's not working for families or communities that need schools. There are delays in getting decisions, be it a yes or a no. And it's causing, in some cases, investment capital to move to other states and to other jurisdictions, which means that this state misses out on jobs, and it misses out on opportunities, and it misses out on homes. So let me talk about 3 things we think need urgent repair in New South Wales and what we do to fix them. Let's start by making it clear who's in charge of planning in Sydney. Right now we have 5 ministers and 13 government agencies responsible for planning in Sydney. Yet even with all the ministers and agencies on the job, the time to get a decision is getting longer and longer. Development application processing times have grown. This year the average time is 99 days, and last year it was 83 days. Now the planning system for many people has become frustrating and confusing and difficult to navigate. In short, it's unworkable. Just look at one of the most exciting projects, and I say that genuinely, but the most exciting projects in Western Sydney, the Aerotropolis. There are 8 agencies involved, and for good reason there are 8 agencies involved. The Department of Planning and Environment, the Western Parkland City Authority, Western Sydney Planning Partnership, Penrith City Council, Liverpool City Council, Sydney Water, Transport for New South Wales, and the Greater Cities Commission. Now, we want agencies, particularly between jurisdictions, to work together. But approvals for projects are often held ransom to the least efficient and slowest agency within that cluster. And we can't have a race for the slowest. We need to get projects moving before investment flees the state, more often than not for Queensland or Victoria, or worst of all, for a jurisdiction outside Australia. So here's what Labor will do. Other than the minister responsible for local government, planning responsibilities will sit with the Minister for Planning in a Labor government, and that will be Paul Scully, who's sitting on table 7, just if you want to talk to him later on tonight. And the Planning Minister will be in charge of cutting red tape and streamlining what has become this complex process. He will be tasked by me to get on with it, to get the investment flowing and the projects moving. The second thing a New South Wales Labor government will do is set proper housing targets in Sydney, especially around public transport assets. Now, the bulk of public spending on transport infrastructure in the next 10 years will be on the metros, and there's a hefty price tag attached to that at $65 billion. And I'm not going to criticise the New South Wales government for that investment, or the New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet, or indeed his predecessor for that much needed infrastructure investment for New South Wales. But while the bulk of that new metro stations are east of Parramatta, the majority of population growth is earmarked for the west. The government is putting most people in the areas with the least amount of access to public transport and the least amount of people in areas with the most accessible public transport. And I'll give you an example. Public transport access in North Sydney, Woollahra, Lane Cove and Mossman is rated 3 times better than public transport access in Camden. Yet the projected population growth in all 4 areas is just 19,400 people, which is almost 70,000 less than what is planned for Camden alone. So a Labor government will charge the Greater Cities Commission with rebalancing this population and housing growth and setting new housing targets along those metro lines to the city. We'll introduce a target of 30% affordable, social and inclusive housing on surplus public land. We'll target transport land holdings which are close to public transport assets and well located for housing growth. And we will release land and finally do something meaningful, we believe, for the housing supply for New South Wales. We think this is about fairness and equality, especially for people living in Western Sydney, especially for young people who need to be able to own or rent a piece of the greatest city on the planet. People in Western Sydney in particular are still waiting for the public infrastructure and services that they've been promised for a decade and the decade before that when Labor was last in government. And I'll give you an example. Gregory Hills in Western Sydney has a population of 5,000 people. The suburb next door is Gledswoods Hills, population projected to be 6,000. Now, the demographic of those 2 suburbs is largely young families. Young families have children. There's not one public high school for either of those suburbs. And we need to build a political consensus that delivers infrastructure for these fast-growing communities. The third step is to unscramble the multiple and complex plans for Sydney that have been adopted in the government in the last decade. Now, this is important. Many people who live in Sydney just don't understand where they fit in the firmament of government agencies, organisations and lines on map. We've always considered Sydney to be one of the world's great cities. And then people started talking about Sydney having 2 cities, the east and the west. And then a few years ago, quite laudably, Sydney had 3 cities, a Western Parkland city, as Chris said, a Central River city and an Eastern Harbour city. If that wasn't enough, last year Premier Perrottet doubled it again. Now we have 6 cities in Sydney. Now you might be like me, you might be a bit confused about which one of these cities that you're in, or where they start and where they stop. So I looked it up on the New South Wales government map and I discovered that Sydney isn't just 6 cities. We also have metropolitan cities, metropolitan centres, metropolitan clusters, regional cities, strategic centres, innovation districts, economic corridors, growth areas, employment areas, investigation areas, and urban renewal areas. Now, if I told you that someone lived in a growth area which was part of a metropolitan cluster adjacent to an innovation district, do you know what they would say? They'd say, no, I live in Campbelltown. I don't think people understand the plan for Sydney. And if they don't understand the plan for Sydney, we're not going to get the social licence to grow City, and in particular the political support that we need for urban consolidation. My concern is all these plans are titles and they're distracting from what's really important, which is building infrastructure and delivering services. We've got plans on a map, but no plans for the schools, the healthcare, the jobs and the transport that we need right now, and we need to bring people along with us if we're going to grow Sydney and grow it for the better. So let's start by having a plan for Sydney we can all understand and relate to, one that recognises that we still live in communities, not zones. In 4 months' time, the people of New South Wales will go to an election to choose the next government. And after 12 years in office, the coalition will be asking for 16 years. Now, 12 years is a long time for one political party to be in power. So you have to obviously be wonderful to ask for 16 years. And you'd expect me to say all this as the leader of the opposition. But I have to say, and you'll forgive me for saying it in the context of an election campaign, but it is not the same government that was elected in 2011. The people who've left government includes an award recipient here tonight, Rob Stokes, who I can say unambiguously is one of the kindest, most gentlest politicians and public servants the state has seen. And even as a Labor politician, we're sorry to lose you to the politics of this state. But I need to tell you that the list includes one Premier, one Speaker, one President, 14 Ministers, 7 backbenchers, 24 MPs. It's clear it's not the same government that was elected in 2011 or even in March 2019. We believe, and I've got a dog in this hunt, but we believe that the state needs energetic, committed people to confront the challenges ahead. It needs new ideas, it needs new policies. In short, it needs new blood. Now, on the Labor side, we're hungry for government. We've got a good team that understands the pressures on Western Sydney, and we are ready to step up if we're given the opportunity in just 3 months' time. Thank you so much.